This is episode number 4 of the Martial Podcast. I'm Mark Jacobs, a martial artist, a martial arts journalist, and I tell stories about martial arts, which is what I'm doing here with this podcast. We're going to be joined in a few minutes by our guest, Ellis Amdur, who is one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on the classical ancient martial arts of Japan, as well as an expert in how to de-escalate violent situations, which he teaches to law enforcement as well as civilians. But first, I want to talk about a couple of news items. It was a big fight weekend. Bantamweight champion Sean O'Malley beat Marlon Vera at UFC 299 by outslicking him, outstriking him. He even managed to check some calf kicks, which we said last week on the show. Not many MMA fighters do all that well. So yeah, he looked good. I'm not convinced he's the next big UFC superstar the way some people are making him out to be, but he looked good. Won a convincing decision, which I don't think surprised that many people. Also not that surprising, at least to knowledgeable boxing fans, was former UFC champion Francis Ngannou getting knocked out cold by Anthony Joshua in the second round of their heavyweight boxing match. Got knocked unconscious. A lot of MMA fans who were probably overly optimistic about Ngannou's chances as a boxer after he was neck and neck with the champion Tyson Fury a few months ago, they may have been surprised by this. But they shouldn't have been. He was just totally overmatched here against Joshua. This is really what everyone expected to happen against Fury, and for some reason it didn't. But this is what you can pretty much expect when someone who basically has the skills of a pretty good amateur boxer meets someone with the skills of a world-class professional boxer. That's why you don't see Jake Paul fight legitimate professionals, because this is probably what would result. And that's not a slight against Ngannou. He's a great MMA fighter. But boxing is just a different sport. It's very hard to explain how he did so well against Fury. If Fury goes on to beat Alexander Usyk in their upcoming title unification bout, and then maybe defeats Joshua down the road, that close fight he had with Ngannou, that will go down as the most inexplicable boxing match in history. Meanwhile, Ngannou, he's making noises about continuing with boxing, but he will likely return to MMA. You can't fault him too much for doing the boxing, because he probably made more money in these two fights than he will in his entire MMA career, past and future combined. But by the time he gets back in the cage, he'll have been away from MMA for maybe 3 years. And he probably hasn't even been training for MMA in the past year while he concentrated just on boxing. Now he suffered a really bad knockout at age 37, so we'll have to see if he's anywhere close to what he used to be. He may have traded a chance at MMA immortality for a couple of big paydays. And like I said, you can't fault him for taking that kind of money. Most people would. Though I can't help but think that instead it would have been nice to see him adding to his MMA legacy the past couple of years. And some really unfortunate news that has come across my desk recently. In just the last couple of weeks, I've seen 2 separate stories about people dying in martial arts competitions, and a third story about a person who ended up in a coma after a competition. The latter incident actually occurred late last year, but it made the news now because the mother of the fighter, named Lei Zhenwan, is suing now the promoters of the Western Canadian Martial Arts Championships where this happened. She seems to be claiming that what was supposed to be a light continuous contact event ended up as a virtual full contact fight, it sounds like. She's also claiming it was supposed to be just an amateur competition, but the person her son fought had previously competed in a professional bout in Thailand. They're basically alleging negligence, if not outright incompetence, on the part of the referee and the promoters, who they're also saying didn't have adequate medical personnel in attendance. I have no idea what the truth of the matter is, except this individual did sadly end up in a vegetative state due to injuries he allegedly received in what was supposed to be a light contact event. Then, about a week ago, Fiza Sher Ali, a young female judoka, died in a competition in Pakistan from head injuries. And even though judo is not a striking art and you're not supposed to try and throw an opponent on their head, if people aren't properly trained in how to throw and especially in how to fall, it becomes pretty easy for someone to land on their head and severe injuries can and will occur. The exact circumstances aren't clear, though reports are she was new to the sport, that she went down quickly at the start of the match and unfortunately never recovered. And the other death occurred just last weekend when Juan Muhammad Haikal, a competitor in a Silat tournament in Malaysia, was supposedly killed after being kicked in the head. Now, Silat competitions, I don't believe, are supposed to allow any strikes to the head, but like you'll see in karate competitions, it's pretty easy for someone to lose control of their own strike or to just carelessly walk into the path of their opponent's strike, and competitors end up getting hit too hard in the head. It happens, whether it's legal or not. Silat matches are at least contested on mats. Back in the day when I was a kid doing karate, you'd fight on hardwood or even concrete floors. And you still occasionally see small local karate tournaments that do this. And that's how people get killed in street fights. Someone gets hurt by a punch to the head and can't protect themselves as they fall and ends up cracking their skull on a hard surface. And it's irresponsible for anyone in this day and age to be staging fighting competitions on hard floors. But that goes to the heart of the point I'm trying to make here, which is that most people in martial arts, whether it's the competitors, the instructors, or the promoters, are not always fully cognizant of the potential consequences to what they're doing. And I'm guilty of that too. Back years ago, I fought in a proto mixed martial arts competition, what was called shoot fighting back then. And this was actually a few months before UFC 1. So, way back. I'd been training in this for a while and just wanted to test myself. I didn't have any illusions that I was any kind of great fighter or ever going to become a top professional. There really wasn't even pro fighting for this back then, at least not in America. But like I said, I wanted to test myself and thought it would just be a good learning experience, which it was. So I did an amateur bout and I was nervous about it because, almost everyone gets scared when they're going into a real fight. It's a scary situation. I was no different. And it's not always a fear of being hurt. For me, it was more fear of failing. Failing, that's really what you fear. Not that I wasn't concerned about being hurt too. Sure, I had that fear. But the main fear for me was I'd done martial arts since I was a kid. And like anyone who trains seriously for years, part of your self-image, it starts to become wrapped up in your ability to do martial arts. The way you imagine yourself as a fighter or a tough guy or just as a man. If you go out there and flat out get your ass kicked, that self-image you have, that evaporates. And what do you have left then? That's the fear for a lot of people. But I have to say, the one fear I didn't have, that didn't really cross my mind at all back then, I don't think, was over the safety conditions they had in place. I didn't ask, was the referee qualified, or would they have a ringside doctor, or would there be an ambulance present? A few years ago, a producer from ESPN contacted me for a piece they were doing about fighters and MMA, I think it was. And he was asking me, as a journalist who covered this stuff, why fighters are willing to take the kind of risks they do. And I could only say from my own experience that you just don't think about all the consequences. I was a young kid in my 20s, and frankly, the thought of how padded the ring was, or would there be a doctor there to take care of me if I got knocked out, that didn't enter my head. And it probably should have. But that's what I'm trying to say. Most people who compete in martial arts, whether it's a karate tournament or an MMA fight, they're younger people. And younger people are a bit more careless with their own well being. So it falls on their instructors and the referees and the promoters of these events to be careful for them. And honestly, many of them just aren't. A lot of coaches and instructors are oblivious to the risks their fighters are taking. And a lot of referees, even in the pro ranks, are frankly incompetent. And the promoters, a lot of them are more concerned about making money than with fighter safety when it comes down to it. So, while I wouldn't discourage people from going out and competing, I would encourage them to be a little careful in how and where they compete. And it's not just in competition you need to be careful of how you're doing this stuff and who you're doing it with. There was an incident just a few days ago in Japan where a kendo instructor at a local high school, who was also apparently an instructor in iaido, which is the art of drawing and cutting with a sword, he was giving a demonstration with a live blade for his students and ended up carelessly cutting open one of these kids' legs with his samurai sword. And the student had to be taken to the hospital. So while I love martial arts competitions, keep in mind there's always that level of assumed risk you should be aware of whenever you enter into any kind of serious martial arts practice. Our guest now knows a thing or two about using samurai swords, as well as assuming some fairly high risk levels in his own training. He's one of the few Westerners to ever achieve certificates of mastery in two separate Koryu, or classical Japanese martial arts. He's an expert in the field of crisis intervention, having worked with law enforcement agencies and corrections departments, training officers in how to de-escalate potentially violent situations. He draws heavily on his unique martial arts background as well as training in psychology to accomplish that. I'd like to welcome Ellis Amdur to the show. Ellis, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you. And thank you for joining us today. To start with, can you tell a little about yourself, how you got into martial arts originally? I think you started in Kung Fu and then Aikido.
Um, well, I started in backyard karate.
Hmm.
You know, I bet you two-thirds of the listeners of my age, I'm now 71, had a physical education teacher who served in the military in World War II, came back with some karate that they learned here or there, and then proclaimed themselves a karate teacher. And I had one of those, and um, actually pretty interesting guy in some respects. He was a pioneer in karate in Pennsylvania. I grew up in Pittsburgh. So I'm one of the typical people who lost a fight and got into martial arts. And so I was training a little bit of karate. It was, in retrospect, it was laughable what I learned, but I got so interested in it. And when I got to college, I walked into what was called Kung Fu Wushu. And actually, some people on the East Coast may recognize this. This was an offshoot of a school by Alan Lee.
Oh,
Alan
sure.
Lee was, Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the very first Chinese to open up his school to non-Chinese. That school is still going strong to this day.
Really, I hadn't realized
Yeah.
that. He's a
Yeah.
old timer. Is he still alive? Do you know?
I do not think Alan Lee is alive. If he is, he'd be in his 90s by now,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
older. Um, and it was remarkable because he was one of the first East Asian pugilistic schools that was having some level of contact sparring.
Hmm.
Um, and at any rate, there was an offshoot school. It was run the instructor name was George H.X. He was a Nation of Islam practitioner, and so every Nation of Islam school needs a Jewish guy, and that was me. And I trained there for a couple of years. The school kind of fell apart, and I went to New York. Was going to go to the main school, which was on 36th Street. And for whatever reason, I decided to walk from where I was staying down on 3rd Street, and got kind of tired. It was a hot summer day, and so thought to myself, okay, I'll go to the Kung Fu Wushu school tomorrow. And I remembered from looking up the address, that there was an Aikido school on 18th Street. And I walked in, and I'd never seen anything like that before. I was, and it wasn't so much the technique. I don't know anything about good martial arts, bad martial arts, but the Japanese aesthetic within a martial arts dojo really impressed me. There's a severity, even in the New York Aikikai, which is a pretty wild place. But there's a kind of severity of attitude and mood that really drew me, and so I started training Aikido. There's a school called Bond Street Dojo, no longer on Bond Street, but the name still exists. And was a instructor named Terry Dobson, and Terry had been a live-in student at the Aikido headquarters, the Aikikai headquarters in Tokyo. And so I was commuting from New Haven, Connecticut, training at Terry's school on weekends, going up to the 18th Street Dojo.
You were still going to
Uh,
college at this time at Yale,
so,
right?
yeah, so I was going to Yale during the week and doing martial arts on the weekend. And then an Aikido school opened up in New Haven, so I started doing it there. I was just enthralled with the whole world of martial arts. And so graduated and thought, I don't want to go to graduate school. There's nothing that my 4 years of attendance in college, nothing that I did that would lead me to further my education at that point. And instead wanted to just do martial arts. So I moved down to New York, actually moved into the Bond Street Dojo at one point. I lived on the mat for about 6 months, and then went to Japan. And thought I was going to be there for a couple of years. Figured I'd train Aikido, come back. Didn't know what I was going to do next, but that was the plan.
You were there, what, 13 years?
Yeah. The plan changed.
What really inspired you to go there? Was it just the martial arts, or was it a cultural thing, or a whole combination of all of that?
Well, the culture was encapsulated in the martial arts. I mean, I
Mhm.
sometimes think Professor Laura Mills' Capoeira school was in the same general neighborhood when I went to the 18th Street Dojo.
Mhm.
And had I taken a left turn instead of a right turn, if I'd walked into Laura Mills School, I would have gone to Brazil and done Capoeira. And I think to myself, that would have been a very interesting life in
Yeah.
a different way.
You might have ended up going from capoeira into BJJ the way you did in Japan, going from Aikido to some other styles. So you might have
Yeah,
been the first American BJJ black belt. Who knows?
good Lord. Yeah. And I'd be rich now instead. Um,
But I think it's a thing a lot of people who train dream of doing, but you took the plunge and actually just picked up and moved there. I think that's something everybody who has done an Asian-based martial arts at some point fantasizes about to go to the source, but you actually did it.
yeah. I had an introduction to an Aikido school, a very small school in Tokyo. I didn't know if anybody was going to be meeting me at the airport or anything. A funny story. I'm 6'6", and for those of you who don't know Aikido, it's what I call arm's length grappling. There's very little body to body grappling, although there's one hip throw that people sometimes do, but it's mostly wristy twisty stuff. And then as well, they're momentum throws that as the person's moving, you slip to an advantageous angle and do things like a clothesline or something like that.
Right.
Done in a particular style, but that's, one way to sum it up. And so there's one very typical Aikido move called Shihonage, 4-corner throw. And it's basically you grab their wrist, twist it slightly, and step under their arm, twisting the arm around and take them in a circle, and then you throw them down. So I'm in the airport hoping that somebody's actually going to be there to meet me. I've got $400 to my name. And I hear a voice and I don't see anybody. And I look down and there is a 4'2" man. And he says, "I am Kuamori." And the first thing I thought is, Jesus God, how am I going to do a Shihonage throw under this guy's arm? Yeah. So he turns out to be the older brother of the instructor, whose name also Kuamori, who was a very, very fit, man of, slightly taller than at that time average Japanese height. He was about 5'7" or something like that. Weighed about 80 kilo. He had one of those bodies that, if he was both a judoka and aikidoka, and if you threw him, he bounced off the ground. He was like he's made of solid rubber. Amazing guy. So I started training at that school then and practicing, and then going to 5 different Aikido schools, including the headquarters. I was half my day was either on the train and the other half I was in the dojo. That was it.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little about your journey through Aikido to Judo, Muay Thai, the Koryu arts. You're a bit of an iconoclast, which I think I said about Kelly McCann last week when he was a guest. I guess that seems to be a trend with guests on the show now. Maybe that's a reflection of my own taste, but you started with Aikido and were very serious about that, but then kind of drifted toward judo and some other arts. I think you said to me a long time ago that you noticed while you were doing Aikido over there that when the senior Aikido black belts were doing any sort of free practice and got into difficulty, they usually reverted to some sort of judo techniques they learned. So you felt you might as well just do something like judo?
Well, kind of. So, I mean, the thing about Aikido is it has an ideology, and the post-war ideology, there's this idea of harmony and the reconciliation of conflict. What people didn't understand is the guy who created Aikido was talking about harmonizing the world through his spiritual power so that the different gods of the universe would all line up properly in approval of him. That's one way to think of it. And so the reconciliation of conflict is, it comes from an old Chinese idea, the heaven, earth, and man, which one way to talk about that in classical Chinese terms is man is a microcosm of the cosmos. So heaven and earth reside in a man's body or a woman's body, the way they do on universal level. Well, the founder of Aikido, a guy named Ueshiba, basically made man a third ordinal power, that the universe was out of balance. And through doing Aikido, practicing Aikido, you put the world in balance. It's kind of different than, peace, love, and harmony, the way most people think of it.
Right.
But nonetheless, so there's this ideology that went along with it that, really fascinated me at the time. But I started having a few misgivings about, just beginning to have misgivings about, the art in surely practical terms. And so
you just interrupt. You did a lot of research on the art and on Ueshiba. You wrote a very good book on him and his creation of Aikido, as I recall, right?
Yeah, actually, yeah. So wrote a book called Dueling with O-Sensei, which is semi-autobiographical, but it's a critical look at Japanese culture as a whole, as in terms of Aikido, a bunch of essays taking, as you say, an iconoclastic look about the
Right.
subject. But I was there. The most important non-Japanese martial arts guy at the time was a man named Don Draeger.
Mm-hmm.
And Don was, it's funny, when I was going to Japan, my Aikido teacher, Terry Dobson, said, "Hey, when you're there, you should look up Don Draeger." And I sort of looked at him arrogantly and I go, I don't want to hang out with people who write books. I want to hang out with people who actually do the stuff. I had
And
no
for
idea.
people who don't know, Don Draeger was one of the pioneers of martial arts in America and one of the pioneer Westerners in Japan, was probably the best non-Japanese judoka in the world at one point around the time of World War II. He was a Marine officer, served in World War II, and then was stationed in Japan and really opened up Japanese martial arts to all the Westerners that came after him, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When the man was in his 50s, he was doing full squats with, I believe, 500 pounds, 400 or 500 pounds. And he's built like a Greek god. John Blooming, very famous Dutch judoka, said Don could beat him in newaza, on ground fighting, anytime. He was, and he did so many things, and he did them well. Karate, Indonesian martial arts. He traveled the world, Chinese martial arts. A brilliant, brilliant guy. I didn't know who he was, so to speak. When I met him, I saw what an impressive guy he was. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that Don was doing is he had this project. He was trying to revive an old academic discipline called haplology, which is the study of conflict. And he wanted young foreigners training in Japan to join different, what are called Koryu. Koryu are combative Japanese martial arts that were created before 1867, when Japan was still a feudal entity. And he was doing this because he thought if each of these schools had one or two foreign students seated in it, there'd be a seriousness in the practice, because there'd be people who had given up a life in the States to travel to a foreign country to train. It would be to the benefit of the dojo if they had serious students, and it would also be great for research.
Right. And we should explain, we should explain, most Japanese martial arts that you see in the United States or even in Japan now are not Koryu. These are newer arts that were created within the last 150 years, some of them within just the last few decades. And there's a very big difference between those arts and what's considered a Koryu art. And it's very rare to find a legitimate Koryu art outside of Japan. Even in Japan, they're not that common, right?
Right. It's because of the historical anomaly of Japan shutting its country to outside influence and having a successful authoritarian, if not totalitarian state for 250 years, a lot of old cultural practices stayed where they would have been in Europe. Equivalent practices were modernized and eliminated.
Right. Yeah, you see barely any really traditional fencing styles in Europe that have a direct lineage back to ancient fencing styles. It went extinct because of sport fencing.
Right, exactly. And that's for the people who do HEMA, historical European martial arts. 95% are people researching through writings and things like that and trying to revive things.
Yeah, recreations. Yeah.
There's about 5% that are legit.
Right.
There are some legit schools in Europe.
Yeah, there's a couple around. But the Koryu are legitimate, have a provenance going back to in some cases, like the styles you do, hundreds of years.
Exactly. Yeah. So I was one of many people who were inspired by Don. He had a group around him, and I admired Don a lot. I didn't want to be in his inner circle because I felt like, geez, I've left everything in my home to go on, for lack of a better way of putting it, an adventure. And if I hooked up with Don, I'm safe, right? Because he's been there before me, and in Japan, in the Budo world, everybody said, "Oh, one of Don's guys," for better and for worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I knew him. I drank sometimes with him and all that. He was very kind to me as a young guy, but I kept my distance. And so about 3 months into my stay, I found a one art called Arakiryu. Ryu basically means flow, and most of the old schools have Ryu at the end of the name, means flowing from the past. And Arakiryu, it's one of the best way to think of it is a primeval grappling school. It's one of the oldest grappling schools, but in that period of time, the idea of unarmed wrestling was exclusively sumo. Right, so sumo is a gladiator sport, if you will, where of course you don't have weapons. And if you actually look at the sumo outfit, there's certain ritual gestures which are, among other things, to indicate I'm not carrying any weapons.
Mm-hmm.
But what became Jiu-Jitsu was always assumed to be an armed martial art.
Right.
So
And again, we're talking about the Koryu Jiu-Jitsu styles, not modern styles of Jiu-Jitsu, which very few of those are actually Koryu. They're more modern creations.
Yeah. And, in fact, the oldest schools weren't called Jiu-Jitsu. They would have names like Torite Kogasoku, Koshi no Mawari. I go off on, like I say, tangents. But so basically, Arakiryu was a very rugged style in which you used weapons with low crouching postures, and you came to grips and you tried to deploy your weapon while getting tactical advantage over the other person by sometimes throwing them, just throwing them off balance, things like that.
It was essentially an old battlefield art. It would use a variety of weapons, not just the sword, because if you found yourself on a medieval battlefield, you would probably need a variety of weapons or be able to handle a variety of weapons, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, one thing that needs to be understood is people improperly state that the oldest Koryu were, quote, battlefield arts, that in a sense, they were the training methodology of samurai going to war. And that, in fact, is incorrect. What they were martial arts derived from battlefield experience for various purpose. I mean, they made you weapons wielding, right? But they weren't direct basic training, because at that time, when these things were created, Japan was doing set piece battles with, maneuvers, mass tactics, deployment of firearms. The Japanese musket at that time was technologically superior to the Western musket. They derived it from the Western musket, but they made one that was waterproof, and that was before the West was able to do it. And so, in a way, these old martial arts were people who came off the battlefield and were codifying their experience and using it to educate people they came in contact with. Because the sword was a sidearm, and if you think about a modern battlefield, how often does a soldier use their automatic sidearm? Right?
Their
Very
pistol
rarely.
or even their knife, not very often.
Right. Only when your base is overwhelmed, right?
Yeah.
And and I've talked to warfighters who have done that. It's amazing stories.
Yeah.
But that's not your main weapon. And so then the question is, in some of the Koryu, they became very, very stylized and ritualized. Arakiryu is a very raw art. A lot of body impact. The main method of training in Koryu is pattern drill, which goes by the name kata. And the kata can be incredibly stylized and rather far from what happens between two bodies in space wielding weapons, and they can be incredibly close to real combatives. And the thing that's sometimes hard for people to understand is when you look at a kata, it can look like a choreography, like stage fighting.
Yeah, I mean,
But
there's a misunderstanding about many martial artists what kata is, at least in classical Japanese martial arts. Most people think of kata, like you see in karate, as solo demonstration of techniques, which usually are performed completely different than how you're taught to fight. And because of that, the word kata has developed a stigma among many people in martial arts. But the Koryu kata are all two-person kata, and at least in the styles you do, relatively short and close to the way you would actually do those techniques in a fighting situation, right?
right, right. Now, some forms are to create a situation so you get a specific type of training. In
Mhm.
other words, you put the person in a certain position deliberately, so now you have to survive from that position. So you're training rather than, let's bump fists and roll. Let's start when you're really at a disadvantage.
Mhm.
You're really off balance. Now survive from that position. And and so I like to use the term pattern drill because it's familiar. It's the same thing one does in modern police combatives or urban combatives or things like that, where you are going to repeat a drill of a movement or set of movements to ingrain those reflexes.
Yeah, I think most gyms nowadays, most martial arts schools are going to do some kind of two-person drilling. You're in a boxing gym training, somebody's throwing a left hook at you, and you work on slipping it and countering it, and you keep drilling that until it becomes instinctive. And nobody questions the utility of that. That's just standard training.
Right. Now, what you see in a boxing gym, to use that example, is the trainer will add elements that make the training semi-live.
Mhm.
Right. So let's imagine you've got the pads and a padded vest on, and I'm going to be drilling, say, sidestep, shoot a straight left into your abdomen, take another step to the side, then right hook.
Mhm.
Okay. Now that's the basic pattern. Now you notice I'm not dropping low enough. So before I shoot the hook, you smack me upside the head,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
Or you notice my range is the wrong range. So when I shoot the jab, you stop my head because I've done the wrong range and I can't effectively do the jab. So you add a live element to it. So I learn not just a set of movements, I learn the movements in a way that's effective. So the real question in a kata is, are elements of aliveness part of training? And some of these traditional arts no longer do that. Others do it with a lot of rigor. And I'd say the Arakidu went a lot steps further, and that was due to my instructor, where we made the training very live.
Yeah, I think you had told me years ago that he wanted to go through the system and see, what worked and what was maybe had unrealistic, had creeped into the system over the years. And you guys actually did free spar with hard wooden weapons, which is unusual for most Koru style. I mean, I think it's unusual for most styles in general to spar with wooden weapons nowadays, wouldn't you say?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yes. You know, so and people often ask me, you don't tend to mention his name. It's because he's a private human, and he prefer I don't put him out there.
Mhm.
I was his last student, and so I respect his wishes on all that. People who really, you can find photographs of the two of us together if you look, and people really are obsessive about researching that stuff. People know his name, but like I say, I don't put it out in public.
Right.
But and part of it was just the kind of history he had. He did a lot of dojo breaking when he was young. He figured that was the best way to get training, to challenge people in other schools. And he used to be really frustrated with me because I wouldn't just go into schools, kick open their door, and challenge people to sword fights. Um, and what I said was, they didn't offend me. It's hard for me to fight somebody who hasn't offended me. And he'd say, they are offending you. And I said, what do you mean? And he'd go, they put up a sign saying they exist. And if they say they exist in a town you live, that's Tokyo, that means they're saying, I'm not afraid of Ellis. That's an insult. So, so we would have this kind of contention about this, because my attitude was, if a giant foreigner goes into a Japanese dojo, it's going to be such a challenge and such a violation that the teachers going to feel like, I got to put my life on the line. And all of a sudden, I'm going to be potentially, aside from me getting hurt, which I didn't want to have happen, but I didn't want to hurt somebody who was just minding their own business, right?
Yeah, not to mention,
But
I would imagine the authorities probably didn't take
yeah,
well to foreigners coming in and maiming Japanese citizens.
right. But what happened is, as I progressed, I knew other practitioners who had the same questions about their art as I had about mine. And we started doing, and the Japanese word for this is tameshiai, which basically means to test together.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a word some of the listeners may be familiar, tadyushiai. Tadyushiai is, I'm going to challenge your school, and I'm doing it to destroy you, to enhance my reputation, things like that. Tameshiai can be doing exactly the same thing with exactly the same level of force, but you're doing it to learn. And, and as you accept the possibility of injuring or getting injured, and that's a mutual agreement for the sake of both people learning. And so the difference is, if I was doing a tadyushiai, my attitude would be, what's my best technique? I'm going to use it and that's the one that's my most effective technique. That's what I'm going to use. In tameshiai, to be quite honest, the first engagement, I would always use my best technique because I got an ego. I'd want to win. But after that, I would start trying things out. I'd say, gee, I wonder if this works. And sometimes they didn't work. I remember I was sparring with a fellow named Mike Scoss, pretty well-known guy. And we were at the time using something called a fukuro shinai, which is split bamboo with in a leather case.
Mm-hmm.
And in Aikido, we've got this technique where you feint high and cut low. And it's usually a long weapon against a shorter weapon. But we both had the same length weapon. And I thought, what the heck? I want to see if this works. And I gave a beautiful feint. He raised his weapon in defense because he thought he was going to get hit in the neck. And I dropped low beautifully. And almost in panic, he skipped back and his weapon came out in a way. It's actually a technique in a school that he does, Shinkage-ryu. Mm-hmm. It's usually used to cut the wrist, but just automatically the weapon came out and he skewered me in the eye with it. And, another half inch, I'd probably be blinded in the eye. Took me off my feet.
You were not wearing kendo helmets or anything like that, I assume.
No. The only thing we were wearing hand protectors because we had a regular job and we'd have to use our fingers to type or something like that, but nothing for the head. Who needs that?
And you guys, when you were in the Iraqi-Ryu dojo, you guys were actually doing that sort of thing, but with hard wooden swords or staffs, right?
Yep.
And I think you had told me it got to the point where eventually it was just you and your teacher. Everyone else had quit because they didn't want to do that anymore.
Well, people quit for a lot of reasons,
right?
To be honest, but that was one of them.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things we would do is we rented a gymnasium in Tokyo, in each ward in Tokyo. So Tokyo is divided up in different political entities called wards, coup, and there was a gymnasium in each ward, and you could rent space. They had a great dojo, and it was like 80 mat dojo, if I remember correctly, in the Nakano gym. And one thing we would do is you take all the weapons in the dojo, all these wooden weapons, spears, wooden swords, thing called a naginata, which is a pole with a curved blade, chained weapons, and we pile them up in the center of the dojo, just in a jackstraw pile. And two of us each would get at different ends of the dojo, and we'd run full speed at this pile and frantically grab whatever got in our hands and then fight with that. And so, it was sort of like this semi-mayhem, and you had to recover and do something that was balanced. Because what we were trying to do is replicate the spontaneity of what happens in real combat, whereas what can happen if you do just pattern drills is after a while, you feel safe. You know
Yeah.
what's going to happen next, and so you anticipate it.
Yeah.
And so we tried to have these elements of randomness in it.
I
And
was talking earlier in the show about the assumed risk level that people have when they enter into any martial art, let alone something geared towards hard fighting like that. Um, where do you fall on that? What is too much risk? Where do you draw the line between something that's useful, necessary training versus something that's too dangerous? And how should instructors draw that for their students?
um, that's a tough one, uh, because you have to start with what's the purpose of the art you're training in.
Mm.
What are you trying to accomplish, right? And then what's necessary to accomplish that, right? So in Aikido, we really wanted to accomplish, in the context of using the weapons we were using, which were archaic weapons, we wanted to be at the peak of skill, and we were willing to risk physical injury to achieve that. You know, I've had my head split open, you know, hit with a very heavy wooden sword. I've had fingers broken. I've had other bones broken. Which, you know, when I say that now, I'm like, I did, but yeah, I did. And it was important enough to me to learn that. Whereas, you know, a person could quite legitimately say, purpose of me doing this is different, and that I don't want to go there. And and again, the odd thing is, like in a martial art like Aikido, it's as if it's like I'm never going to end up on a Japanese battlefield.
Yeah.
I'm never going to end up in a Japanese duel. And so it's really bizarre to try to get a skill in something that, in one level, doesn't even exist.
Yeah.
Right. You know, I think the metric, if you talk about combatives, is you look at a military,
Mm.
look at the top military in the world, and that's in the plural. What does it take to construct a special forces professional,
Mhm.
right? And then you also have to look at, is the professional you're developing going to achieve your national goals, right? So, for example, the so-called Green Beret, the Special Forces in the Army, they've got very different goals, say, than MARSOC or Navy SEALs.
Mhm.
They've got different specialties, and so you train them differently,
Yeah.
right? And because if you say, we want the Green Beret to learn to really embed themselves into indigenous populations and act as support and enhancing the indigenous population to act as our allies, and you train Green Beret like Navy SEALs, they wouldn't be able to accomplish their job,
Right.
because the ethics are different. And so there's all those levels of training, and what are you trying to accomplish in your training? And sometimes it's like, I just want to be the biggest dog in the room. So, you know, I'm going to do hard training. I'll risk getting, you know, bone fractures
Yeah.
and all that. Um,
I think a lot of it comes down to who you're entrusting your training to, or if it's a competition, who is promoting the competition and refereeing it. Who are these people around you? Because students, particularly young students, young men, will make those kind of decisions that maybe they shouldn't, but they do because they want to get something real. They want to go after each other. And it's okay if the people around them know what they're doing and can maintain a certain level of safety for it. But I think a
mhm.
lot of times you end up in martial arts with instructors or referees or whatever that are, let's say, less than knowledgeable or less than careful. And that's when things tend to go off the rails, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I trained Muay Thai for a couple of years at no longer exists, but Koei Gym in Tokyo,
Mm.
Saksabashi. And classical Muay Thai, you do not kick the legs more than a slight tap in practice. You only kick the legs hard in a shia, in a
Yeah.
match. And you're also careful with things like head kicks. So every once in a while, we'd have somebody come in who were like a kid, like 18, 19, 20 years old, and his face was all lumped up, and you could see 3 or 4 broken noses on top of each other, and everybody would nod and say Kyokushinkai karate, because Kyokushinkai, they don't take care of their students, they don't protect their students, whereas some people may object because I don't know Kyokushinkai in recent decades. I just remember from back in the 70s. But
Yeah, you just lost us the whole Kyokushin audience. So
sorry about that, brother. Okay, so
yep.
so what I was saying is the distinction between Kyokushinkai and Muay Thai goes right to what you were asking, Mark, because Muay Thai traditionally it's a professional sport. So you train in a way in practice that's going to make you most solid for your fight, which is a professional fight where there's betting, there's money on the line, right? And getting damaged in practice doesn't make good business sense, right?
Right.
Whereas Kyokushinkai absorbed a very classical Japanese attitude, which is called Seishin Tannen. And Tannen is forging and Seishin is spirit. And so, yes, there were matches in Kyokushinkai, but the core goal of most Japanese martial arts, particularly modern arts, paradoxically, is this forging of the spirit through practice. And so the practices, when you were having a match or a fight in practice, you put your body on the line and you try to defeat your body's fear, your body pain, and things like that. So your spirit is transcended over your body. So getting injured in practice had a very different meaning in not only Kyokushinkai, but a lot of Japanese martial arts than say Thai arts. And that goes back to this idea that, what kind of training you do is determined by what your goals are.
Sure. Now, you had mentioned earlier the naginata, which is the other art that you have practiced besides Araki-ryu. You began training in Todaha Buko-ryu, which is a classical naginata style, and there's a modern version of naginata that's done as a sport like kendo, but there's also a traditional Koryu version, which is what you trained in, and that tends to be done more by women than men, right?
Yes and no. So first of all, the name properly is Tenshin Bukoryu. For various reasons, we have had kind of a renaissance in the last couple of years, which required changing our name to Tenshin Bukoryu, which is an old name that was once used. Mm-hmm. So the quick version. Naginata was a weapon of foot soldiers starting in about the 10th century. And probably the first version was an improvised weapon where they took a sword blade and split a pole, lashed the sword blade to the pole, and then they had an improvised glaive, which European term for the same thing. And the naginata was used for several hundred years as the main weapon of foot soldiers. It was supplanted by a spear, and the advantage of the spear is you can pack a lot more armed men in a smaller space, right? Because you're doing thrusting movements rather than swinging movements. And so the naginata was bit by bit largely supplanted as the main war weapon for foot soldiers. Somewhere along the line, it got associated with women, but not as a kind of recreation for women. Japan at one time was an expanding country. Within its islands, there were frontiers, and pioneers would, or from the perspective of the indigenous people who lived there, settlers would start expanding the political boundaries of Japan, pushing into alien territory. Then once Japan was consolidated, you had different feudal domains, which were rivals to each other. And what happened quite frequently is the men of a town, a village, a castle would be off fighting war. And then who's going to protect the home when they're not there? And so we don't know how many. There's little historical records of this, but the assumption is that women protected the home, and this was the main weapon because it's heavy enough that you can cut through a person. It gives you reach, so you don't have to worry so much about infighting. And one of the most interesting bits of historical data I know is my Aikido instructor's mother told me that her grandmother was part of a squad of women in her village. This would have been in the 19th century. And whenever a stranger came into the village, the women would all grab their naginata to confront him. So even to close to modern times, the naginata was, actually a weapon of use. When Japan imposed its totalitarian peace in the early 1600s, everybody had an assigned role, and men were expected to train martial arts, or bushi men, that's samurai, were expected to train martial arts to inculcate their role as the dominant warrior class of Japan. They were about 5% of the population. Women of that social class trained with the naginata to imbue certain values of stoicism, strength, accepting the rules as they were. And the martial arts were a vehicle for that. So bit by bit, naginata specialty schools grew up, and some of them were mostly women. So that's the sort of general history. Now, Tenshin Bukoryu, its historical roots are back in the 16th century. It probably had an extensive revamping in the mid-1800s. And that was done by a husband and wife team. And it's a school that focuses on pattern drills. The naginata is not the only weapon. The main weapon is a naginata with a crossbar, specialized weapon. But they train against spear, sword, chain and sickle. There's some stuff with short sword, a nagamaki, which is a giant naginata. When I was in Japan about 2 years, and just recently married, and my wife and I wanted to train a martial art together. Aikido didn't seem to be the one. And so I had to consult with my own teacher about joining another school. He recommended the Tenshin Bukoryu. And so my then wife and I joined together.
What were the challenges of practicing two separate arts like that, trying to master them both, even though they're different arts?
It's actually quite a challenge that a lot of people don't realize, because these arts are not just a set of physical movements. There's a mindset to each one, literally a worldview. And you could call it an embodied worldview. As you move reflects a way of seeing the world, of seeing human conflict. And I would say most people who try to do more than one art sort of end up just doing generic movement. It's very hard to maintain the separation. And honestly, it took me, because I started with Aikido and it was natural to me. I got to be, at least on the surface, quite expert at Bukoryu. I was made the assistant instructor of the dojo, but I literally had never done Bukoryu once. I was doing the movements properly, but I didn't get it. I didn't get the movements. I didn't know what it should feel like. And I remember one time, after I'd been practicing about 10 years, I was in the middle of training, and it was like a bunch of dominoes shifted inside me. Everything shifted, and I got it. And I saw, geez, this is different from Aikido. And I use the term shape-shifting for this, the ability to shift from one mode of perceiving the world to another. And so I keep them separate. When I do Bukoryu, I don't really think of Aikido. When I do Aikido, I don't think of Bukoryu. When I do freestyle, I let them naturally mix, as needed. But in training and in teaching, I keep them absolutely separate.
Now, I think those worldviews kind of lead into what I wanted to talk to you about next, which is when you came back to America, you decided to work in the field of crisis intervention. Can you explain a little to people what that is, what crisis intervention involves?
Yeah. So crisis intervention, when I came back to America, at least, was considered a subset of psychology. And essentially, it is dealing with people in states of severe emotional, psychological crisis. They might be suicidal, might be undergoing a psychotic break, some kind of a meltdown, even aggressive, assaultive person with homicidal ideation. And the idea is that you contact that person, and with everything you got that's not physical, you try to calm them down so they're less of a danger to themselves or others.
And in your approach to this, you based a lot of what you Oh, we had a little bit of a technical glitch there, but we're back now. I apologize for that. I was saying you used a lot of the strategies you learned from training in Iraqi-Ryu and Buko-Ryu in your approach to crisis intervention. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I came back in 1988, jumped into graduate school, got an MA in psychology, wanted to do crisis intervention. There was not one bit of coursework on crisis intervention in my psychology program. But I joined the unit, and you're just expected to sort of learn on the job. What would take place in therapy in 6 months, you're supposed to figure out to be able to accomplish in 15 minutes. Not to cure anybody, but if you will, to get them in a calmer state than they would be otherwise, or a safer state. And what I found was, and this is to me the most important part of these classical Japanese martial arts, far more important than whatever skill you can acquire using a chain and sickle, is the Japanese had done perhaps the most sophisticated study in human history on what goes on inside yourself and how you can affect another person when you are at blade's length trying to take each other's life. In other words, how do you organize yourself to lead the person to believe you're going to attack high and you're actually going to attack low? How do you organize yourself so the person starts to feel confident and says, okay, I got this guy. He's starting to feel weak. And you've just used that perception to get them to overextend themselves, right? You see certain combative sports folks. Muhammad Ali was a master at this, for example, that for the most part, he could get people believing things not only about him, but about themselves that led them to become vulnerable in a way that he could take advantage. So I was probably most of my work, which, I ended up, aside from doing just crisis intervention individually, but training other people in these skills, was derived from what I learned from the practice of, as you put, the Araki and the Buko.
Yeah. And you trained law enforcement agencies, corrections departments in these methods with a lot of success, right?
Yeah. And, the success can be marked a couple ways. The one is I would get invited to other agencies. And it was all word of mouth. And, I must have worked with hundreds of different law enforcement agencies and correctional institutions. And, it's all over the country. The other thing is people will contact me. Sometimes I'll run into an officer in the street. Sometimes I'll get an email. I used this strategy and was able to manage the situation safely. Thanks very much. So the one thing I tried to ensure is I'm not of the opinion that if only we teach police how to talk to people, they wouldn't have to use their weapons. I think that's silly. It is when there is talking to be done, what is the most effective way to talk to somebody showing these behaviors to lead them into compliance?
Right.
And so it's all behavior. In other words, the assessment is behaviorally based. When a person's acting a certain way, it indicates the likelihood that their mental set is, X, Y, or Z. And then what's the best practice communication strategy to lead that person into compliance? But nothing in what I teach in any sense should make the officer less safe. Even if a verbal technique fails, it helps the officer organize to be ready for things going sideways, and it puts the other person off balance if necessary, so that one can use physical skills more effectively.
And I should say, I recently wrote an article with you on de-escalating violence for a publication called Personal Defense World. I'm not sure if they'll have the article up on their website when we post this podcast, but when they do, I'll post a link in the show notes, or people can just go check out their site, personaldefenseworld.com. But since I was limited in how long I could make the article, I concentrated primarily on some of your suggestions for identifying aggression and how to manage that. But here, I'd like to focus a bit on the part you told me on how to manage yourself before the
Hmm.
confrontation. And that can actually determine how successfully you're able to apply the de-escalation techniques, or even how successfully you can apply physical techniques in the event do turn in the event things do turn violent, right?
Right, right. Okay. So number one is one needs to train one's intuition. Um, what intuition is, it's the primitive parts of the brain signaling that it perceives something as a threat to the organism. That's what it's for. When we have an intuitive, oh, something's dangerous here, there are parts of your brain that recognize a pattern that threatens the living organism that it is. So how do you train intuition? So one way to do that, you can do this in martial arts practice, but if you pare it down to the bare beginnings, the first thing to do is to pick up, how do you sense when somebody's in your space? Not And people have this cliche. They go, oh, when they're an arm's length and a half, they can't punch me without taking a step. But I've had people in my space a block away.
Mhm.
You're walking down the street at night and you see just a couple of shapes. They're so far away you can't even tell male, female, or whatever. And something says, I better cross the street. And if you reconstruct it later, you'll realize that there was something in their pattern of movement. Say 3 heads turned in unison and all looked at you at the same time. And you're not wearing flamboyant clothes or anything. Why are they looking? Well, they're targeting you, right? So you later sometimes can reconstruct what the brain picks up real quickly. So one way to start training the brain is simply, 2 people sort of face each other. One person begins to step forward slowly while talking, just casually talking. And at a certain point, you're going to be in the other person's space. The recipient says stop. Okay. You withdraw or whatever. But the goal here is that the recipient says, how did I know they were in my space? And you're basically looking for what physical sensations tell you too close. And everybody's going to be different. Some people, you get, like, I don't know. It all sounds kind of touchy-feely, woo-woo stuff, and it's not. But it's like some people get like a heaviness in their chest. Another person gets a tingling in their hands. Whatever it is, that's your treasure, because that tells you somebody's in
Yeah.
my space. The next level to this is, do the same exercise, but approach the person while trying to con them out of something, right? And you just, like if you really wanted to get the use of their car over the weekend, say, hey, Mark, hey, look, I've got this girl coming from out of town and my car's a beater. Could you do me a favor? Could we trade cars over the weekend? I promise I'll treat it good. I'll treat you. I mean, I'll even get it detailed before, because I want to impress this girl. And you keep moving forward. So how does your body react to somebody running a con? Now, you can think of this as a kata. It's an as-if practice to simulate reality.
Mhm.
The next thing you want to do is have the person ball up their fists or something like that, point their finger and say, I'm going to mess you up. I'm going to mess you up. And they walk forward. You stop them when they're in your space. You're curious, do you let a person get closer? Like a grappler might say, no, I want him close right now. Whereas most other people say, I want him further away. But how does your body organize around aggression? And the goal here is, in another human interaction, if you notice, for example, let's say when somebody's yelling at you like they're going to mess you up, your neck gets tight, your fingers instinctively clench, and your knees lock, right? So you don't want your knees to lock in a way that would make you unable to move, but you notice the tendency, the muscles to do that. Then somebody's talking to you and says, hey, excuse me, sir, I'm kind of lost around here. I don't know this neighborhood. And your neck tightens up, your fingers curl, and your knees want to lock, well, that person probably means you harm, right? So you can use your physical sensation as an assessment tool,
Yeah. A
right? So
matter of
that's
trusting your instincts, which a lot of people don't do.
yeah, yeah. So the second thing is to learn to assess environments for danger. I'm a very unobservant person by nature. If I have a coffee cup on the table next to my wallet, and I go get the coffee cup and walk away, I probably won't remember I left my wallet on the table. I mean, where's my wallet? Right? I have that kind of perception. Some of our listeners are probably the same. You always have to ask somebody else where you put something down. But I can pick up dangerous things because I train myself to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I do that is I'll go into my workspace and I'll think to myself, man, I hate that guy, Ellis. I hate him. When he comes in today, I'm going to kill him. What am I going to use? And you look around the workspace and you say, okay. Left a letter opener on his desk. I could stab him in the eye with that. That chair, no, it's too heavy. I wouldn't be able to pick that one up. But that's a good paperweight. And you start looking around the room. What is everything you could use as a weapon? Right? Then you think to yourself, where would I stand to do this? Right? Oh, the way the door opens, he'd be able to see me and I walk in. Okay, I'm going to spill something on the floor. So when he walks in, he'll look down to the side and not where I'm standing. Right? And so you just go over all this in your brain. Then you shake yourself out of it and you look at your workspace and say, okay, what don't I need on my desk? I'm going to put that letter opener in a drawer. I don't need a picture of my family in my workspace. Right? I've been doing some of my household billing stuff because I got downtime at my work and I've left my electric bill in that tray over there. Somebody has my address. And so you learn to look at your workspace as what could be used against you. Now, some things you say, I got to have chairs. I know a chair is a weapon, but I got to have them. But the thing is, if you go through your entire workspace in that manner and somebody comes into that space, without knowing it, they're going to realize they're in a controlled environment controlled by you. Okay? So that's communicated that you own the space. But the other thing that this does is it enables you to be trained to scan environments for potential danger without you even knowing doing it. So one example of that is when I was doing crisis work, there was an elderly woman who had suddenly allegedly deteriorated. She'd been a pretty functional person, and she was now announcing that she was the girlfriend of the 16-year-old developmentally disabled boy in the next apartment. And so the landlord had called and said, we're worried about her. Can you come out and see her? So I went out, doors locked. She wouldn't answer it. Since the landlord owns the property, he used the master key and he led me and a social worker in. And this woman started screaming, get out, get out, get out. And I automatically did a scan. And there's these beaded curtains across the room. And I see two knives, the handles of two knives sticking out of the curtains at head height. And so I nudged the social worker and said, talk to her. And so she started trying to engage the woman. I stepped around her and I went and grabbed the knives and she sees I've got the knives. She says, give me my knives. And I was like, and I put them on top of a shelf out of her reach. She's a little person. And I said, I'd love to give you the knives. But when I see the knives, I stutter. And then I put them up on the shelves. And I can't see them anymore. So I won't stutter anymore. I have a few questions for you. And when we're finished with the questions, I'll give you back your knives. Now, it turns out she'd had a brain bleed. And so she was in a delirium state. Mm-hmm. And she believed that Satan was going to come in to her house and steal her soul. And so she planned that when Satan went in the front door, she would back up, grab the knives, and disembowel Satan, knife in each hand. And you can't see me, but I'm 6'6", shaven-headed, and kind of look like Satan, for God's sake.
But handsomer.
But handsomer. Her worst fears were realized, and if I hadn't picked that up, it's very possible she would have backed up and would have had knives in her hand. Right. So once you train your brain to do that, even if you're usually an unobservant person when it comes to where you left your keys, your wallet, when you go into alien environments, you tend to pick up things.
So a lot of this is the mental preparation beforehand, before these situations ever come up, thinking about them and training yourself before these situations arise, how you're going to react, right?
Yeah, yeah. Now, if we have time, so the third thing is, do we have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay. So the third thing is breathing. And, there's all kinds of breathing methods that are, proposed to manage yourself in crisis. The most common is what's sometimes called a 4-4-4 breathing. Inhale at 4, hold at 4, exhale at 4.
Right.
And as a basic method of breathing, it ain't bad. It's got some advantage. Although, if you notice your own breathing, it's important you breathe at the cadence that's natural to you. And you may be 8 count inhale, 3 count hold, and 5 count exhale, right?
Mhm.
So people can be different than the cadence. But the problem with that is you've got to consciously do that. Like you and I square up, and I'm a little nervous. And I say, oh, okay, 4-4 breathing, get me under control. I've taken my mind out of where it needs to be, which is focused on you 100%. So I developed this breathing method. It's related to something called the microcosmic orbit, which is a very common thing in Chinese martial arts. But the way I do it's a little bit different because it has a different purpose. So the essential breathing method is you inhale and you imagine that a column of air goes through your nose, down the back of your throat, down through your body to a couple inches below the abdomen. And you pause there. So you inhale and you hold it for just a second, and you exhale and you imagine that it loops between your legs, up your spine, around your head, and out your nose. Okay, that's the circular breathing.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can do it in reverse. You inhale, you imagine the air goes around your head, down your spine, out the base of your spine, around to the front. You pause at the same place, right below your navel, and then you exhale. The air comes up the front of your body and out your nose. So the first thing is you try both methods, and surprisingly, one method will work better than the other. I don't know why. No one can tell me why.
There's a number of different breathing methods that are used in different types of meditation, yoga, that sort of thing. And I think they all have some utility. And you're right, it's probably about finding what works best for you.
Right. So the first thing is you always do this breath with your eyes open, because what you're really training for is emergency.
Mm-hmm.
And as you practice, so you will be.
Mm-hmm.
If you practice for emergencies, a breathing method with your eyes closed, your brain will be saying, close your eyes, you'll be safer that way. So you keep your eyes open. The first step is you find out which method of breathing is a little bit easier. You practice, let's say, so I go around the head, down the back, and then up the front. So let's say I do this for a while and I'm able to visualize that because I know the air doesn't really go that way. After a while, you're going to feel like a sensation of energy going through your body. Again, people are going to say woo-woo stuff, but I don't know what it is. Call it chi, call it focused attention causes nerves to fire. I don't know. All I know is the sensation develops, and that tells you, okay, you're switched on. Now, what you do, once you do that, you practice it 3, 4, 5 times a day, 3 minutes at a clip. Now, once you can regularly get that sort of hum sensation through your body, you choose stressors in life. Like you're in the supermarket and you're at the fast checkout line, and there's somebody ahead of you, and they turn around and start talking about their food allergies to you. And you're in a hurry. There's 2 people behind you. You can't pick your stuff off the conveyor. And so this person's blabbing on about non-fat yogurt and all this stuff. Then they get to the front and they start sharing all their issues with the cashier. You have someplace to go. You're irritated. You can't get out of the situation. Do the breathing.
Mm.
Now, if it makes the weight better, fine. But that's not the purpose. The purpose is that you associate stress with slower breathing. You're stuck in traffic. You're going to be late to work. You do the breathing. Your spouse is wanting to talk about home decorating, and that's the last thing you want to talk about. Do the breathing.
I
Every
always go
situation.
into it at the dentist's office.
Yeah, yeah. So you're in a situation you can't get out of. It is stressful. You do the circular breathing, and what happens is your brain assumes when this organism is stressed, it breathes slower.
Yeah.
And what then happens is when you are in a confrontation, your breath will slow down without you thinking about it. The advantages of this are when you're breathing slow, you think better. You're able to have a big picture survey so
Mhm.
you can still get look for escape routes and things like that, as
Right.
opposed to this person just disrespected my wife, I got to fight him, right?
Yeah.
Which you get that tunnel vision. The next thing is this: in a lot of confrontations that have not yet become physical, the other individual is trying to assess, can I take you? And if you are calm in a situation that in their world, the victim is not calm, they say, they've got some, I don't know what it is. Maybe they're not acting right like a victim.
Yeah.
Okay. And this then goes to, walking down the street, do you look like a victim, all that kind of stuff. The third thing is this: we humans are pack animals, and we tend to template to the most powerful person in the room. So that's crowd psychology. One person can amp up a bunch of people and then they all do whatever they do. The flip side is also true. If the most powerful person in the room is calm, other people calm down without even knowing it, because it's a limited view of self-defense to think there are predators out there, one of them's going to hunt me down, I have to be prepared. Far more often, you get in situations where just people lose control. They're not looking for a victim, but a situation is created that somebody will be victimized. And maneuvering your way through those situations requires a kind of calm where you are prepared to fight, but you're balanced psychologically, right, so you don't overcommit to any solution.
And I'll also add the breathing doesn't just help you stay calm before the fight, but has a lot of utility in fighting itself because your heart starts racing and next thing you know, you're running out of gas.
Yes.
So being able to calm and slow your breathing really comes in handy, particularly in grappling. If you get caught in a choke, I've been caught in chokes a few times where the person had it tight, but not quite 100%. And by going into some slow, steady breathing stuff I learned going down to a Zen Buddhist temple a couple of times years back, I was able to just keep my heart from racing and keep from getting choked out. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of good all around utility in learning some of these breathing methods.
Yes. And then one final point, because there's a lot of discourse these days about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And trauma isn't how horrible the event it was. Trauma is our reaction to the event.
Yeah.
Right. So one thing to do is, if you've ever been in a situation, be it a car wreck or something like that, or a violent episode in your past or yesterday or whatever, when you're able, you get to a private place and you start thinking about the event and you notice how your body reacts to it. Some people react with anger, some people react with fear. Any reaction is unbalanced. So then what you do is you sigh. And what a sigh is, it's like pressing restart in your computer to reboot it. You just sigh a couple times, and then you just push the event sort of mentally off to the side.
Mm-hmm.
And you start doing the circular breathing. And every time the event comes up, you go, I'll get you in a second. Just stay there. You do when your breathing is smooth, then you bring the auto accent or whatever it is, bring it back to your mind, and you, in a sense, contemplate the image while doing slow breathing. When you can do that breathing slowly, regularly, when contemplating the image of what happened, it no longer has power over you. Because when your car was sliding off the road, you would clamp down, you weren't breathing at all. When that guy was assaulting you and you were pinned down on the ground, you're a little kid, you were crying and yelling for help. Now you're just breathing, looking at an event that happened a long time ago. So this is a do-it-yourself way to handle post-traumatic events that can be very powerful.
Right. I know you've written a few books on how people can deal with violence and de-escalate conflicts, all this stuff we've been talking about. For anyone interested in learning more about that, which of your books do you suggest is a good primer for that?
The best book for so I wrote a series of 13 books, which are clones. Each one is they're each one has a different profession. So, I mean, I have a book specific for law enforcement officers. I've got different books for people who work in jails and prison. It's the same book, but the context is different. For an ordinary citizen who doesn't work in a profession that requires them to be around aggressive people, the best book is Words of Power.
Words of Power.
Yeah.
And I know you've written a number of interesting books, not just on crisis intervention, but a couple of great collections of essays on martial arts and even some novels. Where can people go online if they'd like to hear more from you and what you've got to say?
Couple ways. As far as books, the easiest way, of course, is Amazon. It's all there. My own book website is edgeworkbooks.com. So Edgework is EDGEWORKBOOKS.com. And there's one more site that has my short writing on martial arts. And I also have guest writers. You know, I get other, in fact, Mark, you've written an article for me on that.
Yeah.
It's called kogenbudo.org, KOGENBUDO.org. And that's got short writing on martial arts by myself and other subject matter experts.
I would definitely suggest people go to the Kogen site if they want to learn more about classical Japanese martial arts or just martial arts in general, and go check out Ellis's books, which I've read some of them, and they have some really great information, great perspectives in there. And I really want to thank you for being on the show, Ellis. It's always fascinating and enlightening to talk to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, Mark.
Thank you. And again, down in the show notes, you can find a link to the article I did with Ellis for Personal Defense World on de-escalating violent confrontations. If it's not posted when you listen to this, it should be posted here within a day or two, so check back for that. I also want to thank Eleanor Academia for providing the music to the show. You can find a link to her site down below, as well as a link to my own site. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of the Martial Podcast. And until then, keep punching.